Hi, I'm Thelma English. Welcome back to BritLit Survey. This is session 30 out of 32. If you're joining us this late in the year, you need to go back and start at the beginning. Go back and start at session 1. This is for Christian. It's made for Christian home educators or Christians who didn't study BritLit and want to get a handle on that. You can visit thelmaslibrary.com to find how you get access to materials like quizzes and exams and answer copies and things like that. If you're the teacher, you can let me know. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the privilege to home educate. We're grateful for these students and parents who've chosen to do the more difficult thing, to take a more difficult class. And I pray that you would bless each one of them for all the efforts and the hours that they have spent reading and writing for this class. In Jesus' name, we pray. Amen. Welcome back. All right. Last week, you had a volunteer step forward for your Imitation of Christ devotion. Go ahead and pause the video while one of you reads the selection that you made. Okay, let's get going. We're almost done with this class. You only have opportunity to hear another couple of devotions. So be sure and get someone to volunteer to read a selection next week. And again, from our Dover copy of Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, we are only reading just a small portion of it. It's a very large collection, and we are reading, I would guess this is less than 10% that we have an opportunity to read. Schedule review for session 30. We are going to meet the Romantic 6 this week, today. These are not the only 6 Romantic poets, but in Britain, these are the most famous 6 that Dover decided to include in their collection. There are other famous Romantic poets, of course, but these would be the most popular and the most influential and the most well-known. Today, we'll take a quiz in just a few minutes on Dickens, Tolstoy, and Chesterton, the short stories we read last week. And we'll be talking about English Romanticism in these 6 Romantic poets. This week, you are reading Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's found in the Kreutzer Sonata and other short stories by Tolstoy. And this, we talked about this one last week. So you're prepared to read that. It was last week's lesson, but you're reading that this week. And then you're going to choose 12 poems this week, 2 poems from each of the 6 poets included in our Dover anthology of the English Romantic poets. There are 12 total poems that you'll be reading from that anthology. And you're also, besides Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, you're also reading MacDonald's The Day Boy and the Night Girl. It's a short story. It's in your syllabus on pages 317 to 330. So that again is 13 pages of reading, and I don't think there are any pictures, so it's quite a bit of reading. There is no Thelma read aloud for The Day Boy and the Night Girl. It's not necessary. You don't need a Thelma read aloud. It's a story. It's very easy to understand. Death of Ivan Ilyich, you remember from last week that there are a total of 9 sound files that total 130 minutes, so 2 hours and 10 minutes to have me read to you Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, and I highly recommend that you listen to those sound files. They're found in session 29, or maybe they are in session 30. They're in one of those 2 sessions. So you're reading Death of Ivan Ilyich. You are reading MacDonald's Day Boy and Night Girl. And you're reading 12 poems. You get to choose 12 poems, and I'll help you choose which ones to read in just a little bit. You're going to take home your open book exam this week, today, and it is due your last day of class, session 32, in 2 weeks. And you can talk about that after class today. You can talk about it more after class next week. You should go through it this week. Anything you don't understand, maybe circle it or something like that, and then ask your teacher about it next week, your teacher or a parent. There's some cool sound files I have up for you besides the Thelma read aloud of The Death of Ivan Ilyich. There are 2 sound files from the McLaren Institute. It's a Think Institute. I'm not sure where it's from. They'll tell you. But they're both Peter Kreeft talking. And one is Peter Kreeft. He's a worldview teacher teaching on Tolstoy worldview and then another one of the same person teaching about evil in the Lord of the Rings. So if you're a real Lord of the Rings fan, then you definitely should listen to both of those, but they're definitely extra. They're nothing that's assigned, but I do recommend that you take advantage of those Thelma audios. And I hope that you brought your copy of English Romantic Poetry like I suggested that you would. I'm sure you all did. Most of the Dover titles look kind of like this now. They have that dark blue, then plus some kind of a picture or something. Mine is quite old. Mine looks like this, but it's the same book. So if you have the old copy, it looks like this. And I'll be reading from mine, you'll be reading from yours. We're going to be reading about 6 poets: William Blake, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and not normally just called Shelley, and then John Keats. And I've highlighted the 3 of the 6 who lived a very short lifespan. Byron only lived 36 years, Shelley only lived 30, and Keats only lived 26 years. And you'll be choosing 2 poems from each author. So you can go to the introduction in the book and see what you might want to read from each one. It has a great introduction. I suggest that you read that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get started. And then they have the table of contents, and they start with William Blake. They go in the same order, and they give you all the titles of the poems that they have in each one. And we'll be using this today. So if it's in your backpack, you'll want to get this out and turn to the table of contents, put a piece of paper there or something. But we'll be using those extensively today. And you were told to bring those last week, so hopefully you have those. Now I have a little bit of a treat for you. Now you know what Romanticism is. You know what it's all about. You know how it's all about the heart and following your heart. A student gave me this little book that was a little book that somebody gave to her, and it's all about following your heart. And this book it's called Pocahontas. And these are the only words that are on the pages. And so I scanned these in for you and added the words from the pages. This is how the book came. And this is on bookshelves, destined to be gifted to children, little girls especially, who loved Disney's Pocahontas. And this is the sad reality of where Disney is at today. So here we start out with Pocahontas, book made for children. Life's path can sometimes be difficult. Like the waters of a flowing river, it is ever changing. It is hard to know which choices to make or which turns to take. How do you make your decisions? For there is so much in life to behold. But if you listen closely to the sound of your own dreams, to the voices of the wind and the wisdom of the trees, that's Grandmother Willow, the wisdom of the trees, you will soon discover a strength inside you, and you will understand the answers you seek are already within you, just waiting for your grasp. So look with more than your eyes and be guided by the truth inside you. And never, ever be afraid to follow your heart. What do you think of that? Good life advice or not? And it's called Follow Your Heart by Flavia and Lisa. All right, going straight to the romantics. This is William Wordsworth. I don't know why they painted him with his head tilted down this way. I think it's an effort to show that he is pensive and perhaps moody or melancholy or something like that. You can see that he was born in 1770, and you know the publication date of the lyrical ballads, which changes writing and poetry forever, basically. And of course, he published those in the year 1798. So you can tell when he's 28 years old, he published those. And actually, they didn't get published for a while after that. But anyway, written. Wordsworth is a British poet, of course, credited with ushering in the English Romantic movement with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads in 1798 with Samuel Coleridge. And you need to know this. You need to know this date. You have to have it memorized forever. Lyrical Ballads is a collection of 23 poems. His idea of using simple natural language was absolutely revolutionary for poetry. Think about Pope's essay on man, where everything followed a pattern and had a rhyme scheme, where the meter matched, the syllables matched, there was rhyme. Each stanza followed a rhyme pattern. And with lyrical ballads in these poems, they rarely have meter and rhyme. They're just prose. They're just written. They are his observations on essay, on nature. And contrast that with Pope's essay on man. And you can see how this is a revolution of thought of how poetry should be written. The poems cover a range of themes and subjects, but most of them focus on ordinary people and everyday experiences. It includes several that are written in ballad form, so it does have a specific form where you tell a story with your poem. And these poems are very innovative in style, and they have an emotional power that is amazing. I think you will think they're amazing. It's the power and the beauty of nature. Nature can be, we will even say, nature is awe-inspiring, but inspiring you to be in awe of what or whom, inspiring you to be in awe of nature itself as a goddess, or to be in awe of God. And that's the difference between the Romantic poets and Alexander Pope, who says the Christian looks through nature to view nature's God. Now, this is the magnificent landscape of the Lake District in Cumberland in Britain that deeply affected his imagination and encouraged Wordsworth's love of nature. If you grew up in kind of a wealthier home in a beautiful countryside, you would probably be inspired by nature too, perhaps even inspired to write some beautiful poetry. He was also known for his long walks in the countryside, and that's also good for you and good for inspiring imagination. And he believed that spending time in nature was essential to a person's physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. And we might even agree with that also. Both of his parents died when he was quite young, and he was separated for a period of 8 years from his sister Dorothy, and they were extremely close. So that was a painful separation. Words that we might use to describe a romantic poet, as you can guess from this painting, might be moody, pensive, brooding, dark, melancholic, something like that. They think so hard that they're, depressed. And of course, some of them probably were clinically depressed. During a summer vacation in 1790, Wordsworth went on a walking tour, as most of the Romantics did, through revolutionary France. Most of them went through Europe. He went through revolutionary France, the French Revolution. The bloody part was 1798, but even 1790, things were pretty tough there. And he went through also Switzerland and Italy. And we're talking about a walking tour. On his second journey to France, Wordsworth had an affair with a French girl, Agnes Vallon, a daughter of a barber surgeon by whom he had an illegitimate daughter, Anne Caroline, and this is his daughter. The experiences were the inspiration for the poems Tintern Abbey and then the Prelude. Now, Tintern Abbey is a real abbey in a real place that on this walking tour, he experienced this ruin of an abbey, the ruins of Tintern Abbey. And it was very inspiring for him to write poetry, to think what happened here all these centuries ago and what life there must have been and what went on. I think it was quite inspiring, and then also provided inspiration for the Prelude. The Prelude is a poem of about 900 lines, unless you count all the revisions, and then it gets into the thousands of lines. This is the Norton Critical Edition of the Prelude, and you can see the dates on the side of the spine say 1799, 1805, and 1850. This was published, revised, republished. The 1850 usually gets all the credit. The Norton Critical presumes you want to read them all, and so it gives them all to you. And it is true that there are some unique lines that are found in one but not the other. Generally, it got longer and longer. There were a few places where it was trimmed. It's very easy to get lost in this, but we will be looking a little bit at the prelude because you need to know what it is. And after these journeys, he had some unhappy years. Yes, this is what ladies looked like in the 1790s and early 1800s. Think about it. This is before you even have any family history, probably. In 1805, his brother John was drowned in a shipwreck, and he had a strained relationship with Dorothy, his beloved sister, and with Mary, his wife. So he just didn't do really well with women. His sister never married. His sister pretty much devoted herself to him, to making copies, revising his copies, writing letters for him, doing all types of things for her brother. She was just dedicated to her brother. In 1795, Wordsworth met Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and this is a very important relationship, friendship. He and his sister, Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy, lived in Somerset. This is their place in England. And then later they lived in Alfoxden to be nearer to Coleridge. This estate, I looked it up. It's always fun to see where do these poets live. And of course, there are various houses where Wordsworth lived, but this is kind of a pretty estate and it's still beautiful. But I looked it up and it was sold in 2020. It really needed a lot of repair, and Buddhists bought it and they're making it into a meditation retreat. So that's kind of appropriate after William Wordsworth, and they thought so also. In 1798, Wordsworth started to write large and philosophical autobiographical poems. So that means poems about himself, where he kind of philosophizes. They're completed in 1805, revised continuously, and then published posthumously in 1850 under that title, The Prelude. And I showed you my Norton copy of The Prelude. And I suppose you can get this in any library. You certainly should be able to. It's a long work describing the poet's love of nature and his own place in the world order. Wordsworth's financial situation became much better in 1795 when he got an inheritance. They called it a legacy, and was able to settle down with his sister Dorothy and then just write. And I know some of you are artists and writers, and wouldn't that be nice to be gifted with such a legacy or an inheritance that you could just enjoy your large English home in the countryside and write or paint or whatever it is that you love to do. Wordsworth and Dorothy, his sister, spent a year with Coleridge in Germany, where he wrote several poems, including the Lucy poems. I think there are 7 of those. And it's debated. Some people think these are written about his sister. The poet always uses a substitute name. After returning from Germany in 1799, William and Dorothy decided to return to the Lake District, that other beautiful place. In December 1799, William and Dorothy moved into a small cottage at Town End, a place now called Dove Cottage at Grasmere, and then they lived here for 8 years. And this is their Dove Cottage, which is also a beautiful, well-kept little cottage. And it was here that Wordsworth produced some of his best works. And also Dorothy wrote her Grasmere journal. So she also journaled, and her journals have been printed. And in some of her journals, she talks about her brother, and those are things people are interested in. And here she acted as his secretary and then his beloved companion. Dorothy's friend, Mary, came to visit in 1799, and that's where William, it's a poorly written last sentence, but this is where William Wordsworth met his sister's friend Mary, and then their relationship started to blossom. In 1802, Wordsworth married Mary Hutchinson, and they had 5 children between 1803 and 1810. But you have to remember, he has that other daughter that he abandoned in France. His new wife and they cared for Wordsworth's sister Dorothy for the last 20 years of her life, and Dorothy never married, and Wordsworth loved his sister, and he and his wife took care of her. Wordsworth moved to Riddle Mount, Ambleside, England in 1813, where he spent the rest of his life. In his later years, Wordsworth abandoned his radical ideas. And here we're going to look in our poetry anthology. What kind of radical ideas did he have? Well, you remember he went to France while they were working through their revolution, and he had written even some poetry about that. If you open your Dover English Romantic Poetry and Anthology, edited by Stanley Applebaum. If you open that to page 41, and you should have probably a pencil or a highlighter as we work our way through these poems today. We'll be using this copy extensively in class today. Open to page 41, and you can see at the bottom of the page, it says London, 1802. Now, Wordsworth took a gradual turn from political radicalism, and it's reflected in this poem. In this poem, instead of focusing on the radicals and wishing the French the best, with their revolution, and talking about other revolutions and even wanting to fight those revolutions, in this poem, he focuses on Milton as a man who dutifully submitted himself to the will of God. He didn't go fight a glorious revolution. Remember, when we read Paradise Lost, we saw how Milton fought injustices in his country, where they had beheaded the king in 1649, and they lived for 11 years during that interregnum before they had a king again in 1660, and we call that the Restoration. And that's why Paradise Lost was written, because they had lost a monarch, but they lost this opportunity, and that was their paradise lost. So he's saying, well, maybe Milton did it right. Milton fought with his pen. So this is really in contrast to the other Romantics who saw Milton as a great poet of the Puritan Revolution and then a defender of regicide. So the other poets said, yes, Milton had it right, support killing the king. And Wordsworth is kind of saying, well, maybe Milton had it right. Maybe we fight with our pen rather than killing the king. So Wordsworth here, at this point in his life, has turned away from his youthful enthusiasm for the French Revolution. London, 1802. Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. She is a fen of stagnant waters. So she's a pit of foulness. She's a pen of stagnant waters. Altar, sword, and pen, fireside, the heroic wealth of hall and bower, have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. We are selfish men. Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. Thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked oceans, majestic, free. So you pick up, there's a rhyme scheme. So didst thou travel on life's common way in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart the lowliest duties on herself did lay. So here he's kind of thinking maybe we should be fighting with our pens instead of, off with his head for the king. Very interesting, isn't it? So later in his life, he became a patriot, and he became a conservative as far as politics, a conservative public man. And he was involved in political causes. For example, he fought against Irish oppression. And of course, many of these causes are very just and right. If you don't know about the Irish, there's a little side note here. The Irish were forced into labor. The Brits were in charge of Ireland. Some of these Irish were forced into labor. They were kidnapped. It was just like Africans being kidnapped from Africa. They were kidnapped from their homes. They were transported to the British colonies, to the Americas, and even to the Caribbean as indentured servants, they called them, in bonded labor. But basically, an indentured servant, they were indentured forever. If they were given money, then they were overcharged so that they always owed, so that they could never get out of their servitude. It was a slavery, and they were treated like slaves. Wordsworth fought this since it was essentially slavery. He was a vocal critic of British policies fighting for Irish independence. So this was one of the good things that he fought for, that many people were fighting for during this time. And of course, this is a time of other British writers writing about the same things. Encouraged by Coleridge and stimulated by the close contact with nature, Wordsworth composed his first masterwork, which is Lyrical Ballads, that collection of 23 poems that opened with Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. And that's in our Dover anthology. And it's a long poem. You can see it starts on page 63. So turn with me to page 63. And it's actually kind of a cool poem. The Ancient Mariner is a really cool poem. It's you can see the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, page 63. And you can see it's in 7 parts. Having a ship having passed the line was driven by storms to the cold country toward the South Pole, and how from hence she made her way course to the tropical latitude of the great Pacific Ocean. So first she was driven toward the South Pole. Then she made her way to the tropics. And of the strange things that befell, and in what manner the Ancient Mariner came back to his own country. So this one poor mariner got driven pretty much to the South Pole. Then he got driven to the tropics, and then he finally made it back. And of course, the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is his poem, and it's a lengthy poem. So I'm going to tell you, you can see, take a look at the next few pages, that it's written with meter and rhyme, which is pretty cool, but it's quite long. It goes in your anthology through page 81. So if you choose to read that particular poem, I want you to know a little bit about that one, and we'll go through that when we get to Coleridge. The prelude tells us the story of Wordsworth's own life, and that's found in the prelude, from his childhood in the Lake District to his experience as a young man studying at Cambridge and his travels through Europe. The poem expresses themes of memory, nature, imagination, and the relationship between the individual and society. You know, what do you owe society, and what kind of things, what are your thoughts? So he goes back over his own life. And I'm going to open the prelude, which you don't have, and I'm just going to read you a few of the things that I have underlined, and the beginning of the prelude, the very first part. So he starts, and this is kind of important always, the first words of a poem. Was it for this? Unusual words, isn't it? Was it for this that one, the fairest of all rivers, loved to blend his murmurs with my nurse's song, and from his alder shades and rocky falls, and from his fords and shallows sent a voice that flowed along my dreams? For this didst thou, O Derwent, traveling over the green plains, near my sweet birthplace. And he goes on and on and on and on. So this is rather, I don't want to say boring, but it's boring. He talks about some birds that he saw, and they communed, and some spirits communed, and he's talking about his boyish days. Yes, he starts out with his boyish days, line 76, and that is in the 1799 version. And he says, they guided me. One evening, led by them, I went alone into a shepherd's boat, a skiff that to a willow tree was tied within a rocky cove, its usual home. The moon was up, the lake was shining clear among the hoary mountains. Hoary always means white, so snow-capped. From the shore I pushed and struck the oars, and struck again in cadence, and my little boat moved on just like a man who walks with stately step, though bent on speed. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. Not without the voice of mountain echoes did my beat move on, leaving her still on either side. So he's talking about he took off in this boat. And then he is talking about, by the time he gets to line 155, he's talking about ice skating, that he's all shod with steel. This is another instance from his boyhood, talking about ice skating. By line 170, he's saying, not seldom from the uproar I retired. So he's saying he's kind of a loner, and all romantic poets are usually loners. So he often got away from the crowd. And then he talks about playing tic-tac-toe. He talks about playing cards by the time we get to line 215. He talks about fishing by the time we get to 235. He talks about having a kite. This is all what we're reading, his boyhood memories. And then there's one important section that's very famous because apparently as a child, if this is true event, by the time we get to line 268, he says, beneath a tree and close by the lakeside, a heap of garments, as if left by one who there was bathing. Okay, he saw a heap of clothes and he thought he'd wait and see who gets out of the swim. Half an hour I watched and no one owned them. Meanwhile, the calm lake grew dark with all the shadows on its breast, and now and then a leaping fish disturbed the breathless stillness. The succeeding day, so he never saw anybody get out, and he waited till it got dark. The succeeding day there came a company, and in their boat, sounded with iron hooks and with long poles. At length, the dead man, mid that beauteous scene of trees and hills and waters, bolt upright, rose with his ghastly face. So the body, he drowned, and then he swelled up, and then he popped up while they're looking for him the next day. And then he talks about as a child at age 5, he got lost horseback riding while he was at his grandparents. At 5, that might be kind of traumatic. And then he comes home on break. We're to line 350 by now. And he says before he went to school, he returned right away. He'd only been 10 days and his father died while he was on break. So these are all the memories of his childhood. And by the time we get to line 418, he says, the earth and common face of nature spake to me. Rememberable things sometimes, 'tis true. Okay, so the earth speaks to him. He likes quietness, and he does feel the earth is actually speaking to him. And he begins in the second part, where he starts the lines over again, part second. Thus far, my friend, have we retraced the way through which I traveled when I first began to love the woods and fields. The passion yet was in its birth, sustained as might befall by nourishment that came unsought. For still from week to week, from month to month, we lived a round of tumult. Duly were our games prolonged in summer till the daylight failed. No chair remained before the doors. The bench and threshold steps were empty. Okay, goes on and on and on. The innocence, the vitality of earth. Talks about horseback riding with his brother. He talks about ending the day with a meal with his brother. And of course, his brother, as he's writing this, is really important, especially later on, because his brother dies. And he talks about when he's 14, his relationship with nature. And he talks about, now this is the second part, line 215, thus day by day my sympathies increased, and thus the common range of visible things grew dear to me. So this is like an extended, if you remember Henry David Thoreau from American Lit and reading from his diary, what was Thoreau's diary called? I'm in the wrong class. My brain is in Brit Lit. His journal, you all know what it is. Anyway, it's like that, but it's very extended. And he's seeking the sublime experience. He uses the word sublime over and over and over. And he tells us, this is in the second part, line 351. He says, for I would walk alone in storm and tempest, or on starlit night beneath the quiet heavens, and at that time would feel whatever there is of power and sound, to breathe an elevated move by form or image unprofaned. And I would stand beneath some rock, listening to sounds that are the ghostly language of the ancient earth. And he goes on, he's looking for this sense of possible sublimity. And then he talks about his morning walks were quite early. And I do understand this is very similar to American Lit with the preacher who loved to go out in storms and pray. There is an attraction to going out into nature to experience a storm and pray, but he's out here appreciating nature. And he calls the calm a holy calm by line 405 in the second part. He says that spirit of religious love in which I walked with nature. So this is his religious love. And then he talks about in his 17th year, He's now up to his 17th year. He tells us how old he is. He lived with God and nature communing, and he was the most intense of nature's worshipers, and that's the end of part 2. And then he talks about the wandering cloud. The guide I choose be nothing better than a wandering cloud, and I cannot miss my way. So he follows this wandering cloud. This is in book 3. I've just underlined some things that I thought you might find interesting. And then in part of book 3, he talks about bending the Sabbath and going out. What need of many words? A pleasant loitering journey through 2 days. Continued, brought me to my hermitage. He just went out in the wood and stayed for 2 days. So he does love nature, and that's enough from the prelude. I could go on for about an hour reading some of my favorite sections. And I think as Christians, we kind of know what he's thinking as he goes out and appreciates nature, except he's focusing too much on nature and looking to nature as though nature is personified. He's made nature almost into a little bit of a god. And it does appear that Wordsworth was some type of a Christian, at least later on in his life, but I'm not sure by his writing if we could support that he was a real born again Christian. But in the prelude, we have lots of chances to see. Now you have a few samples of the prelude. Here on your screen, you see pages 25 and 46. So on page 25, you have a little bit of the prelude. This is from on page 25. It says lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. This is part of the prelude, and this is a lyric poem, Tintern Abbey, which is later expanded to an actual epic length in the prelude. So you've got part of it anyway. The prelude, he wrote the first Germany, I told you, when he was in Germany. And by 1804, it was expanded to 5 books. By 1805, it was expanded to 13 books. And the 1950 prelude is his authorized version, his last one. After his conversion to Christianity, Orthodox Anglican Christianity, Coleridge and he intended it to be greater than the 10,500 line Paradise Lost of Milton. He wanted his to be longer than Milton. And think of what how he compares himself to Milton. That you've read Milton's Paradise Lost. It is a genius epic of rhyme and meter and story. And Wordsworth's prelude is, and the lines composed upon Tintern Abbey. These are perhaps majestic words, but they're quite random, following his own personal life, event by event. They're nothing like John Milton's Paradise Lost. And yet people and his friends tried to explain his writing, the lyrical ballads, going from Tintern Abbey. You can see at the top of page 27, this poem is labeled as Tintern Abbey. You can see this is nothing like Milton. But one thing, should you choose to read this poem, on page 26, for example, I see the word sublime right in the middle of the page. Page 27, I see the gloomy wood, and he's looking at it in all its dizzy raptures. And then near the bottom of the page, he talks about a sense sublime, using all of the typical romantic poems, poetic words. Top of page 28, from this great earth of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they half create and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. Okay, that's what the earth gives to him. These are great quotes if you ever write a paper on the Romantics. And then in the very middle of this page, the Dover Anthology, page 28, in the middle of the page, he says, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Famous Wordsworth quote that kind of says it all. Top of page 29, if you count down about 8 lines, you'll read, he was a worshiper of nature, and other poems. And then we go on by page 32, we're into the Lucy poems, which are nice. I'll leave that for you to decide. Okay, so you've got samples. It was written, the prelude was written in 1805, rewritten, being published after his death by his wife. And of course, the prelude, I should have said 1799, then 1805, then 1850. These are based on his experiences of his walkabout and his experiences out in nature. And then he works on that for the rest of his life. He works on that journal for the rest of his life. So it was published by his wife after his death. And this was thought to be absolutely huge. And some people reviewing it just thought it was glory on paper. And other people reading it thought, yeah. So if you are, then you're okay. Scholars argue about which version is best. All three are in the Norton Critical Edition, so it's massive. It's really big. It's about 1.25 inches thick. Each is about 900 lines total. Wordsworth begins in his childhood and he just relates these various events. The style is very conversational. It's his journal. And that's the big deal, that it's conversational. That's the big deal. It's not like Alexander Pope. It's not like John Milton. The big deal is it's conversational. It's filled with childhood thoughts. I read you some of these. His dislike of school, his losses, his preference for the outdoors. It was a new kind of poetry that paved the way for future romantics. And it's almost an autobiography. It kind of is. It was hailed by some as extraordinary and many as quite ordinary. Some statements border on transcendentalism, where he talks about transcending to be with God, and then others are basically pure pantheism, where he feels one in part with God and with the earth. So you tell me. All right, William Wordsworth died in 1850. This is his burial, and I believe he was buried, yeah, and Mary Wordsworth. So he and his wife buried right here together. And that is his death mask. I think that we've looked at a death mask prior in this class. You make a mask of somebody because then you know exactly what they looked like, and it will aid future painters to know exactly what they looked like because this is pre-photography. He died of pleurisy. So water on around your heart, that's pretty bad even today. They put tubes in and drain the liquid off, and then the liquid builds up again. It's from the heart not working very good. So she published the Prelude posthumously. It wasn't real popular at the time. Now it's recognized as a landmark, a seminal moment in poetry and in worldview, which is, kind of crazy. But this is the topsy-turvy of the worldview, where Earth was at the bottom of that triangle of worldview, and now Earth is at the top. Everything's about Earth, Earth first. And this is where things started off, or he gets the credit anyway. Tintern Abbey, it's really easy to find pictures of Tintern Abbey. In 1798, this was the final poem in the collection, Lyrical Ballads. The poem opens with a personal experience and uses it to explore themes like nature, memory, to what does he remember and what was his memory like, and then imagination. He imagines what could have been going on here before and things like that. These are themes that Wordsworth comes back to again and again in his poetry. And again, Tintern Abbey starts in our anthology on page 25. Doesn't say Tintern Abbey on 25, but I think it does at the top of 27. They presume you know some things here that they shouldn't presume you know. The poem takes its name from Tintern Abbey. It's an actual ruined abbey on the banks of the River Wee in Wales. Wordsworth visited this abbey in 1793 during that walking around, and the experience had a profound effect on him. The poem's written as an address to the abbey, and it describes the emotions and thoughts that he experienced during his visit. If you've ever been to an abbey like Westminster Abbey, it is kind of awe-inspiring. You go stand inside and you look up and you just realize how small you are and how much people thought about building these grand cathedrals to honor God. Amazing. So it's divided into 5 stanzas, and each stanza reflects on a different aspect of Wordsworth's experience at Tintern Abbey. In the first stanza, he describes the beauty of the natural world that surrounds the abbey, and he marvels how the landscape has remained basically the same since his last visit 5 years earlier. In the second stanza, he reflects on the power of memory and how his memories of the abbey have sustained him during the intervening years. He describes how the memory of the abbey has become a part of his being and how it has influenced his perceptions of the world around him. If you've ever traveled and gone somewhere that just amazed you, it can kind of become part of what drives your worldview and your perceptions, because you realize, if you live here in Oregon, there's nothing really older than 1859. We became a state. There are a few old log houses from that period, but you have to go back east to find something really old. And here in America, even back east means there's nothing more than 400 years old. The natives here didn't build with stone and bricks and things like that. So you have to actually go to Europe to find really old things. But this abbey has kind of become part of his being. The third stanza shifts to a more philosophical tone as Wordsworth reflects on the relationship between nature, the human soul, and the divine. And I do think there can be a connection, because I think nature, and that's why we do need to get outside, nature does help you reconnect with God if you're a Christian. You go out and you see everything He's created, and it's sure not an accident. Sometimes you need to get away from rows and buildings and brick and mortar and sheetrock and things like that. And you need to get outside. That's why we go camping. It's certainly more pleasant to sleep in your bedroom than in a tent, but you go camping to go experience, to see things bigger than yourselves and see things that have been there for centuries. Wordsworth suggests that nature is a reflection of the divine, and Alexander Pope would agree with that, and that through nature we can connect with the divine. But this is getting a little into pantheism. In the fourth stanza, Wordsworth turns his attention to his sister, who is with him at the abbey. Remember how close he is with his sister. He describes how she too has been influenced by the beauty of nature, and how they've shared this deep and meaningful connection through their experiences. Finally, in the fifth stanza, Wordsworth looks forward to the future, and he expresses the hope that the memory of his visit to Tintern Abbey will continue to sustain him in the years to come, providing spiritual renewal. And this is where we get into all things kind of hinky, just kind of not right. That it's a little disquieting to think that his memories of Tintern Abbey will sustain him in the years to come and provide spiritual renewal. And so he ends the poem with a declaration of his love for nature and a recognition of the importance of the natural world to the human spirit. And I do think that part is true. And now, did you get raptures? Did we send you into raptures? You need to experience Tintern Abbey or any abbey, any cathedral. It's kind of cool. They lose their roof first because, of course, that's more man-made style materials or things that can disappear more quickly than the walls that are made out of stone. And so they can stand for a long time if they don't have an earthquake or it isn't destroyed, World War II or something like that. But it's a pretty cool abbey. All right, moving on to our second major poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who also was a close friend of Wordsworth. Coleridge was a literary critic. He was a philosopher and a theologian, or so he thought, who was one of the major figures of our English Romantic movement we're studying now. He's best known for his poems, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the Kubla Khan. And I told you about The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's a long poem, but it is worth your time to read. And then the Kubla Khan, both of which are in our printed collection in the English Dover Anthology. And I would highly suggest that you read these. I'll give you a little overview of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and then you'll want to read it, of course. Kubla Khan is a little more unusual. Both were written under the influence of opium. And so it would be the equivalent of the Beatles writing Yellow Submarine, under the influence of LSD. You simply can tap into some untapped resources inside your brain, and you can create things with drugs in your brain that can't be created otherwise. Many of them do permanent damage, and Coleridge had this permanent damage. The Beatles lucked out, I guess. But many of the people, what other group is it? Well, the Beach Boys. Brian, somebody who is their leader, who is still alive in 2023. He's quite elderly now, but he's still alive. But he used drugs. I'm not sure if he used LSD or if it was all cocaine or heroin or something, but he used drugs extensively, and they helped him to write his lyrics. And he's suffering because of that. He has quite a dementia going on and disconnection when he tries to speak coherent sentences. If you like the Beach Boys music, you should look up an interview with Brian, whatever his name is. And it's quite profound. You have to feel really sorry for him to think he did that to his brain, but he did that willingly. So he's best known for his poems, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and then Kubla Khan. And they're both in our printed collection. You could do both of those. I love these heart quotes. What comes from the heart goes to the heart. I don't know what that means, but Coleridge quote. So The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. In 1798, this was the opening poem of the Lyrical Ballads. It's a supernatural story, typical to Coleridge, with themes involving guilt, punishment, redemption, and it's told in short verses with a real strong rhythm, and it has a rhyme scheme. And it's in the poetry anthology. If you want to open it up, look at it, starting on page 63, and it goes to page 81. So it's a long poem because it's a ballad. It tells this whole story. The poem begins with this old sailor stopping a guest on his way to a wedding, and the sailor wants to tell the guest his story, but the guest is a little reluctant at first, but eventually he stays and listens to this guy's story. The story is about this old sailor's journey on a ship with a crew that includes him and some younger sailors, and they sail southward, but they're soon beset by a storm and become stranded in this foggy, icy world. As they struggle to free the ship, an albatross, okay, this big bird, great big bird, this albatross appears and leads them out of the fog. The sailors are overjoyed and they hail the bird as a good omen. The ancient mariner, however, shoots the albatross with a crossbow, much to the horror of the crew. They blame the mariner for their misfortunes, but when the fog lifts and a favorable wind returns, they change their minds and they celebrate. So first they think, no, he's leading us. And the mariner says, no, we can't follow him, and kills him. And then when they get out of the fog, they realize, but their joy is short-lived. The ship becomes becalmed, so no wind to push them anywhere. Becomes becalmed in the middle of the ocean, and the crew is tormented by thirst and hunger. They're just stranded. The dead albatross hangs around the ancient mariner's neck as a symbol of his guilt. He has to wear it. The mariner begins to see supernatural things, such as the ghostly forms of the ship's crew and a sea monster. He begins to realize the gravity of his action and the enormity of his guilt. He must pay for his crime, and he becomes a living symbol of the dangers of sin. Finally, the mariner sees a ship in the distance and tries to signal it for help. The ship is revealed to be a ghost ship, and the crew is made up of the spirits of dead sailors. They play dice to determine the fate of the mariner and his crew. In the end, and this is at the end of the poem, so I'm just retelling the story. In the end, the ancient mariner is the only one to survive. He's returned to shore, where he wanders the world, telling his story to anybody who will listen. He hopes that by sharing his tale, he'll redeem himself for his terrible sin and find some measure of peace. And that's the story of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, do you want to read that one? Isn't that cool? Many years later, Coleridge explained that the poems in Lyrical Ballads were meant to show human nature under two influences: supernatural influence and just ordinary influence. The albatross represents innocence and the mariner's guilt. There are slimy things that crawl on the ship's deck and ghostly forms of the crew that haunt him. Cruel, huh? Coleridge is one of our 6 major poets. There are many others who didn't make the cut for our Dover anthology. If you read the introduction, he's best known for his association with William Wordsworth, and then The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the Kubla Khan, and also Christabel, all 3 of which are in our Dover anthology. So if you want, you're free to pick 2 poems from each one, pick 2 of their most famous, or you can read something more unusual if you like. Throughout his adult life, Coleridge suffered from crippling bouts of anxiety and depression. It has been speculated that he suffered from bipolar disorder because he went back and forth, a mental disorder that was unknown and unlabeled during his life. Coleridge chose to self-medicate, which many people with mental illness still do, with opium, and no one had any idea how addictive opium was, but he became an addict in the process and then kind of ruined his brain. He was a lifelong sufferer of these debilitating ailments, and he called them his malady, which I'm sure he'd be clinically depressed. At this point, we would medicate him too in our age. The symptoms include severe bouts of depression, anxiety, physical pain that often left him unable to work or even function normally for extended periods of time. And he called it his malady. Some medical professions now, they just have to guess. You can see opium tincture. This is what they used, otherwise called laudanum. It's even how they would sometimes put a baby to sleep, is put a drop of laudanum on their tongue up to about 75 years ago. People just didn't get it. So some people even think maybe he had chronic fatigue syndrome because of his pain. He died of heart failure at age 61, likely from the long-term effects of his opium addiction, because like everything else, it eats your brain cells and then destroys the rest of your body also. Addiction does. In the years leading up to his death, he suffered from a variety of health problems, including gout. That's where you have too much uric acid in your system and it makes your toes hurt so bad. Some people have even gone to cutting off their toes because their big toe hurts so bad, real painful. Rheumatism, so terrible arthritis, and then even respiratory issues, all of which were likely exacerbated by his addiction. And then you take more opium to deal with it, and then you can't do anything. William Blake, moving on, our next poet, was a poet. He was a painter. He was a printmaker. He even did the illustrations for the prints. So he was quite an artist with pictures and with words. He lived his life in London. He was quite eccentric and very creative. And he had a penchant for wild, kind of dreamlike imagery and then spiritual things that themes that led to people labeling him as mad. He was self-taught as an artist. He worked for an illustrator for magazines and books doing these illustrations. You can find William Blake's illustrations all over the internet, which is kind of cool. He was really influenced by the Bible. Pretty much all of his artwork is biblical artwork, almost all of it. And his poetry, lots and lots of his poetry is biblical too. His most famous works include Songs of Innocence and of Experience, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and The Tiger, with a T-Y instead of T-I, that explore themes of innocence and experience, good and evil, and then the relationship between humanity and the divine. And all of these poems are at least represented in our anthology. Very often with something really long, they will not, if we look at Blake here, he's the second poet, they can't print all the long poems. So they'll pick what they think are the best parts, just like what I do in our PowerPoint. William Blake, his work actually starts on page 1 after the table of contents, and he has Songs of Innocence, and they print the introduction. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, pipe a song about a lamb. So I piped with merry cheer, Piper, pipe that song again. So I piped, he wept to hear. And he goes on and on. It's kind of cool. And he has all types of little poetry in here. You can tell songs of experience, the introduction, so you know. And let's see, the tiger is on page 7. Tyger, tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Symmetry. In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? With the hand dare seize the fire. So he's talking about a myth of Prometheus. All of these poets presume that you are familiar with classical mythology, and they have mythological allusions all over in the poems. I realize you can't do every class all at the same time, but there are some times when you need to know the classics. I don't know if I'll ever make that class, if I'll record it. I've made the class. I don't know if I'll ever record it. We'll see. And so he goes on and even talks about, if you go down to 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th stanza of the poem on page 7, when the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? When he talks about the stars throwing down their spears, he's talking about that angelic war in heaven. And he finishes with, tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye doth frame thy fearful symmetry? So he's got some kind of cool poems. He has all types of cool poems. I think you're going to love these. But all of these are at least represented. The Creator by William Blake. He was, this is his artwork. It's called The Creator. And instead of God reaching down and touching the finger of Adam, as on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which is only about 150 years prior to William Blake, he's got his own version of this. So he was quite an accomplished artist, as you can tell, and his paintings and illustrations often have religious or mythological subjects. He was deeply influenced by the Bible and his own mystical visions, and his work reflects his belief in the spiritual interconnectedness of all things. He died in London at the age of 69, and this is his death mask, so we know what he looks like. That way, with computers, somebody even today could make a painting of Blake. Those death masks are quite genius idea that they had before cameras. Okay, we're going to move on to George Gordon, who became Lord Byron. So we're going to call him Lord Byron because that's a little cooler. She Walks in Beauty, page 114. Go to page 114. 114. This is one of my favorite poems. This is my Lord Byron favorite. She Walks in Beauty. And the she is Mrs. Milmo, whom he met at a party and she was wearing a morning dress, which normally would be dark navy or black, but because it's an evening thing, she's wearing this morning dress of spangled black, so it's sparkly black, and he's describing her. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, so her dress kind of looks like the sky. And all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. And so he's just talking about her dress, which is kind of cool. He's one of the 6. He's still widely read. He's still influential. You can tell he really likes to dress. He's got fancy clothes on here. He was born in London, spent much of his childhood in Scotland, where he inherited his title and then the family estate of Newstead Abbey. Byron's notability rests not only on his writings, but also his life, which featured aristocratic excesses. So he's kind of the rich and famous guy, huge debts, numerous love affairs, and self-imposed exile. He put himself into exile. He was famously described as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. You can see he has a rather short lifespan. Let's see, add 24 to 12, 36. Yeah, 36 is pretty young, isn't it? He was known for his larger-than-life personality and his scandalous private life, He had numerous affairs, and his sexual exploits were the subject of much gossip and controversy. He served in Italy's revolutionary Carbonari and in Greece's war for independence against the Ottoman Empire. He contracted a fever and died at age 36 in Greece, and he remains a national hero in Greece for his fighting. If you see the Dover biography on Byron's love interests, they will tell you each poet gets a little mini biography. And if you read his biography, it will tell you that some of his lovers, his cousins, married women. Married women are always easier targets, I suppose. And then his half sister and more, his Sunday school teacher, all types of people. Poets often aim at married women because they think they're easier to get to than a young girl who lives at home with her parents, who won't let that happen. Poems include She Walks in Beauty, the one we just read, and The Destruction of Sennacherib, and then a poem on spent youth written just a few months before his death. Let's go to page 115 for The Destruction of Sennacherib. My first experience of this poem was actually in seminary. I didn't find it on my own. I found it when we were taking Old Testament survey, and we got to 2 Kings 19. So if you have your pencil on page 115, the destruction of Sennacherib, this story is found in 2 Kings 19, verses 20 through 36. And this is has an amazing rhythm. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue waves rose nightly on deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, the host on the morrow lay withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. And the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved, and forever grew still. And there lay the steed with his nostril all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride. And the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider, distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow and the rust on his mail. Mail is chain mail. Of course, they didn't have chain mail, 2 Kings 19, but for Byron's sake. And the tents were all silent, and the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmoked by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. You might remember that 2 Kings 19, when King Hezekiah, the Assyrians came down and surrounded Jerusalem. While Hezekiah was king, Isaiah was one of the prophets, and Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, spare us, spare us. And Isaiah put a letter in the temple before the Lord and said, are you going to let people talk about you the way these people talk about you, Lord? And the Lord told Isaiah to tell Hezekiah, don't worry. And the angel of the Lord went and slew 180 or 85,000, I think, most of them. A few of them went home, but most of them were slain overnight. So you could even choose those two poems because you already kind of know about them. And the second reading, you always appreciate them. But this reading does not count. Let's go to page 143. And on 143, you can see this Lord Byron poem. On this day, I complete my 36th year. So on his birthday. This is written just a few months before his death. This poem, if you look on the next page, it will tell you it was written January 22, 1824, and he died April 19 of that same year. So from January to April. And he writes, "'Tis time this heart should be unmoved, since others it hath ceased to move." Okay, so it's time for his heart to die, for him to die, because he ceased to move others. Yet though I cannot be beloved, still let me love. Nobody loves me, but let me love. My days are in the yellow leaf. The flowers and fruits of love are gone. The worm, the canker, and the grief are mine alone, always dying from love. sickness. It's a great poem. And he talks about Greece. She's awake. Amazing, amazing, isn't it? And of course, he dies really young. But those are some cool poems. Shelley. Okay, we're going to move on to Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was born into a wealthy family, attended Eton and also Oxford, where he was expelled for writing a pamphlet advocating atheism. That's really bad in his day. And you can tell by looking at his lifetime, he also lived a very short life. Let's see, 1792, 8 years, add that to 22. He lived to be 30. His poems are often dark, brooding, gothic. Let's look at page 147. Page 147 in your anthology. Don't you like it when we take an actual look here? When we have the time. 147. And this is called Stanzas Written in Dejection near Naples. The sun is warm, the sky is clear, the waves are dancing fast and bright, blue isles and snowy mountains where the purple's noon transparent might, the breath of the moist earth is light, around its unexpanded buds, like many a voice of one delight, the winds, the birds, the ocean floods, the city's voice itself is soft, like solitude's. And then he gets more. Let's go down to stanza 4 on page 148. Yet now despair itself is mild, even as the winds and waters are. I could lay down like a tired child and weep away the care, life of care, which I have borne and yet must bear. Till death like sleep might steal on me, and I might feel in the warm air my cheek grow cold, and hear the sea breathe o'er my dying brain its last monotony. And he just gets more depressed. I think we call him clinically depressed and medicate him, and then he could be miserable more. Shelley's personal life was marked by tragedy and controversy. He eloped with his first wife, Harriet Westbrook, when she was only 16 years old. It's always really bad. And they had 2 children together before their marriage ended in scandal and Harriet's suicide. He later married Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She's Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, with whom he had 4 children. But their marriage was also marked by tragedy, including the deaths of 3 out of their 4 children. Shelley himself died tragically at the age of 29 when his boat sank in a storm off the coast of Italy. Despite his short life of 29 years, his poetry and ideas have had a profound impact on that English Romantic movement, the literature, and the Romantic culture. Amazing, really. All right, moving on to John Keats. Keats' career spanned only 4 years. His poetry is characterized by sensuality. That doesn't go over really well in the early 1800s. Sensuality, beauty, love, mortality, and the transience of life. You know, life is here and then just gone. A blade of grass, the Bible would say. His work is marked by a deep sense of melancholy and longing. And we as Christians would say he's longing after truth, longing after God, longing after the way to live your life forever and be happy forever. And of course, these people are all very self-centered. They're very introspective, looking inward to themselves for truth. And what does that get you? It really only gets you darkness, doesn't it? You know, all the evil things that come out of the heart and mind of humans. So they're looking inside themselves, looking for beauty in life and truth, and they're seeing all the dark human things, all the really bad things. So his life is marked by a deep melancholy and this sense of longing. He provided a model for later romantics. You write about love and your love experiences. That's what you write about. Many of Keats' poems are inspired by classical art and stories. So there we are at classical lit again. If you don't understand classical literature, if you haven't read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you haven't read the Old Testament, and you haven't read the Greek tragedians, and you haven't read some of the Greek philosophers at least, and a few Greek, uh, things by Plato and Socrates, you just you can't get far in your literary experience without knowing classical literature. So his poems are inspired. He's got one that's to Homer, and he's got an ode to a nightingale, and he has an ode to a Grecian urn, so an ode to a pot. Like many of the romantics, he also toured Europe in a typical walking tour, just going around seeing all of Europe to see all the old things and all the inspiring things. He was ill for a long time, and Keats was finally diagnosed with consumption. If you like to read old books, old novels, and they talk about people having consumption, it's TB. It's what we now know we call tuberculosis or TB. And it's the coughing disease. And eventually you just kind of cough till you start coughing blood and your nose bleeds, and uh, you can even cough little pieces of your lung branches, your brachial tubes in your lungs. It's pretty harsh way to go, and it can last for years and years before it kills you. And people move from place to place trying to find a climate that does better for it. The doctor put Keats on a starvation diet and anchovy and a piece of bread every day to reduce the blood flow to his stomach. It's just so sad. He also bled Keats, where they would cut them with a little lancet, thinking they'd get rid of the bad blood and then the body would create new blood. But what we know now is that was even though it was a standard treatment of the day, that would have contributed to his weakness, and it sure didn't help him at all. And he died at age 25. Keats' death came, and it's been depicted in art for centuries. His death came February 23, 1821, at age 25. It's believed he was clutching the hand of his good friend Joseph Severn at the time of his passing. We read about that, and apparently Joseph Severn was really a good friend. But this is just really sad. And this is his young English poet. This grave contains all that was mortal of a young English poet who, in his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the malicious power of the enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone. Here lies one whose name was writ in, I don't know, something. Anyway, that's Keats' grave. You can look it up if you care more. And here is a beautiful little, not a bust because it doesn't have his shoulders, but a beautiful head anyway, made from his death mask. So you can probably even buy these at some souvenir stores now. And then people have made, these are sketches and painting of Keats. And then people can still draw these. And then they imagine, of course, that imaginary scene of Keats on his deathbed with his friend holding his hand as he coughs himself to the end to death. Quite sad. And that is it. I will see you next week. Remember, you have 2 weeks for your open book final. And if you have time today, then you're welcome to talk about the final. Definitely look it over this week and make sure that anything you know you can't answer, that you mark it somehow so you can ask your parent or teacher next week during class and get some help with it. Okay, the Lord bless you. Bye-bye.